Well, with me here in the studio is Dr. Seijiro Takeshita, the Director of Mizuho International, a financial services group, and Dr. Jonathan Hopkin, a reader in comparative politics at the London School of Economics. Thank you both for joining us. You had a challenge, keeping things as clear and simple as Rupert there. But let me start by asking you both what you think. I mean, it's clearly working at the moment, isn't it?
For the time being, yes. I mean, he's only shown one of his three arrows, monetary easing. He's still got the fiscal policy and deregulation to come. Now, we're all thinking that deregulation, which is most painful, will probably come after July election. But because of his massive, success so far, and a lot of voters going for his policies, it's most likely they'll be front-loaded. So there's a lot of very good expectation, feel-good factor that's arising in Japan right now.
What do you think, Dr. Hopkin? Because it feels like Japan is a bit of an experiment for the rest of the world to look at.
Yeah, it's a fascinating experiment. I'm sure here in Europe people will be looking very hard to seeing what the data says. I mean, it's very early to say what the long-run effect is going to be. It could be a brief bubble and then a return to deflation. We don't really know. But of course, the next year or two, we'll start to see what effect it's really had.
But are you in favour of this kind of policy? Because there are different camps that everyone falls into. Do you think this will work?
Well, certainly there's a very strong view and growing every week, really, as we see more and more terrible data from Europe and especially the Eurozone periphery, suggesting that austerity isn't working. So we could say that the current policy mix has been unsuccessful, and a shift to a more expansionary policy is growing in support. So I think there's more and more of a case for shifting to a more expansionary approach.
I mean, Dr. Takeshita, you have to put yourself on the line here. Is this the right approach?
So far, definitely. A jab in the arm, it's certainly working compared to the previous government, which basically did nothing. Now, we're at a stalemate. So basically, there needs to be a kind of a jab in the arm policies, and this was exactly that. Now, most important thing is we need to bridge this momentum. And therefore, we need to come up with a lot of policies on the fiscal side, which would have a good multiplier. In other words, good domino effect to the economy. Now, this is where it's difficult because, our current government, LDP, has always resorted to leaning back to vested interest, where the multipliers are low, which feeds their vested interest in votes, but does not really relate to the economic growth. So this is where we have to watch with a hawk's eye to make sure that they revert back to looking for growth rather than feeding their own vested interest.
And Dr. Hopkin, is there a real risk of inflation as well?
Well, certainly. I mean, that's the objective in Japan, is to create some inflation. They're in a deflationary situation, have been for a long time, and that, of course, is disastrous.
It can get a bit dangerous, though, inflation, can't it?
Well, it can, but we know how to deal with inflation. There's a kind of ironic saying that economists are always fighting the last war. The current economic theory is dominated by reactions to the inflation of the 1970s, but we haven't had a big inflation problem since. And actually, what we need to deal with now is output and employment. Inflation doesn't seem to be a problem in the near run, and of course, if it emerged, we would know how to deal with it. We would raise interest rates and cut deficits.
How has this been for the rest of the region? Has there been a ripple effect? Are most countries around in the Asia-Pacific rim supporting what Japan is doing?
Well, I would think so because, again, Japan is the core center of the Asian growth. And obviously, we're also financing very heavily, for example, in FDI, foreign direct investments. And for Japan to rejuvenate its standing, especially these Japanese export corporations, for them to come back on their knees, especially walking away from this excessive strong yen that we were seeing last year, which I think is the biggest success, to turn that into weakening the yen. This would have a continuous knock-on effect for these companies to start investing. And that should be a very, very big plus factor for the area as a whole.
And is that starting to happen? Are we starting to see more investment in Japan?
We will, definitely. We aren't seeing a clear evidence of capital expenditure reviving very strongly, but if you look at the sentiment of the minds, like in diffusion index, it's very clear this coming back. And of course, if you have a lot more elbow room, thanks to the fact that you have weakening of the yen, profitability rising, and also pricing power as well, of course, the first thing they'll do is invest because they've been underinvesting for over 5 years.
You say the neighbours support it, but I have to ask about South Korea, who've come out and said their central bank that this is a real risk to its economy. Obviously, that's because of the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, I mean, all the other manufacturing countries will be upset about this. I mean, especially Germany, from the European point of view, won't be happy at the decline of the yen, and they will be reassured that the euro is not responding spectacularly, but they prefer a cheaper euro, obviously. It helps their exports. So there are trade-offs here between different countries and areas.
Rupert raised an interesting point in his story about the ageing population. I mean, that you just can't escape from that.
No. No, but I think many people are far too pessimistic about Japan's demographics. Look at Europe, for example. Did Europe disappear from the 60s and 70s? No, it did not. Japan still have innovative technology, and our per capita GDP is over $40,000, meaning that we're a high value added creative economy. So there are path methodologies. Important thing is we don't regress back in the old code of things, which had been in the past 15 years. And that's one of the reasons why this first part of Abenomics, at least, is a good jab in the arm.
But you're sounding very optimistic. If you're living in Japan and you're elderly and you're on a pension, do you believe in this? Are you thinking I'm going to go out and start spending?
If you're elderly right now, things are fine. If you're going to be elderly in 20 years, that's much more of a problem. And in order to make sure that these situations get mitigated to a certain degree, the first thing we need is tackle the problem, not backwarding, but forwarding, to rejuvenate the economy and create new areas of growth, which is what we're doing right now, I think.
It's going to be interesting to see then. You both want to say that we have to wait for the coming months to see how this will all pan out. Thank you both very much for joining us.